Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Romans Education Part 7, and this is session 73. We're going to go immediately, as we're moving through the book of Hebrews when we left off in 71 and 72. We're going to go immediately to Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 1. Now, just so that you kind of have this in your mind, remember what we're looking at in the book of Hebrews. I told you that there was no strong meat in the book of Hebrews. And they were being looked at and said, you become dull of hearing. And when you ought to have been teachers, didn't we talk about that? And when you ought to have been teachers, you have need of someone to teach you. I don't know how much we got into that, but I think we did. And so Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 1 says this. Wow. Yeah. Well, you know what? That does not match that, does it? Hold on. Does it? 73 and 74. Well, I know what that verse is about, so let me just say it like this. That's what I get for not having my own notes in front of me. I can't segue into these things. This actually wound up on your notes for 71, 72, but we didn't get all the way through those. So I had to take that and put it onto the front of this. So the notes that you're looking at are the notes that several weeks ago I thought would comprise 73 and 74, but we didn't get through 71, 72. So they wound up in the front of this. So actually, if you have your notes from 71, 72, you'll see this. Matter of fact, I think I can even tell you the... Page 5. Page 5? Okay. That'll be... Let me see if I can... Oh, okay. 5. Yeah, okay. So, what we were looking at is we were looking at the sons of Belial. And when we left off, we talked about Eli's sons not knowing the Lord. And they were the sons of Belial, remember? We talked about that. And we talked about that title a little bit. And so what I wanted to do is show you that, back here, during the reign of David and Solomon, if I just kind of put a timeline up here, let me do this. It's not going to match this up here because I have more to fill in here. But you have that let's call this the first course of punishment, which is the doing of that. Of course, it was predicted in Leviticus 26, but the doing of that is recorded in the book of Judges, where for 450 years they're under the judges. That was that first course of punishment. And then there was a second course of punishment that was to come along for Israel. But what God did is that after the first course of punishment, and before he heaps on the second course of punishment that he predicted would happen if they did not obey him and follow his law, he interrupted the punishments and he gave them an interlude of mercy, in which he rolled back the judgments. And during the reign of David and Solomon, he provided almost 80 years, almost a century of unprecedented blessing and prosperity to the nation of Israel. David subdues all their enemies. Solomon comes along after him. Now there's a reason that God rolled back here. He's doing several things here. Does anybody know why God would stop those judgments, give them victory over all their enemies? Because they deserved the second course of punishment. But instead of bringing it in, God kind of rolls all that back. He suspends that. During the reign of David and Solomon, Israel controls more land area than they ever controlled. They are richer than they've ever been. They're more prosperous, and the word of what's happening with them goes out into all the world. Remember, the Queen of Sheba hears stories about that, and she comes to see for herself. And remember that old hymn was written about this. She says, I came to see because I just couldn't believe all the things that I was hearing, but truly the half was not told me of what's going on. And remember that old hymn, the half has ne'er yet been told? You know, well, anyway, that's the passage that old hymn came from. That, you know what, things are actually better with God than people heard. Well, this is what's happening here. Does anybody know a reason why God would roll that back and suddenly give Israel something that they did not earn, certainly under the law? Why would He do that? All right, it's a testimony to the nation of Israel to say, let me give you a foretaste of this kingdom out here. And this is just a taste. If you think that was good, wait till you get that. There's something else. What else? Oh, you're right there on it. Because with David, God makes a covenant. Because by the way, when God has Moses write Leviticus, didn't He tell Moses Israel is going to endure all 5 courses of punishment? He knew they would fail. And so, because He knows that, He realizes that if Israel is ever going to become that great nation, if they're ever going to become the head of all nations, if they're ever going to be a tool that is fit to be utilized by God in His plan and purpose of repossessing the world back to Himself from the adversary, if that's ever going to happen, then He is going to have to do some things. And in this covenant with David, He covenants for the 5 mandates of the Davidic covenant. That He will be their Redeemer, He will be their deliverer, He'll be their avenger, He'll be their king, and He'll be their blesser. Because if He doesn't make sure those things happen, if He doesn't provide for that, as long as the focus, Satan's focus of his policy of evil is on the nation of Israel, excuse me, they demonstrate over and over, they cannot handle Belial. They are no match. And we realize that there's coming a point during the courses of punishment when they're actually going to be expelled out of the land and become Satan's lawful captive. Remember, we talked about that. So that's how bad it is when Satan is focusing on them. During the time of this dispensation of grace, when they become a nation again in 1948 and they're sovereign in their nation and there's no Gentile power over them, you understand that's not in their program. That's today during the dispensation of grace. And that's what can happen to them when Satan is no longer focusing on them as a nation. Who is he focusing on today? Yeah, the church, the body of Christ. That's who he's focusing on. Because if he's wasting energy on Israel as a nation, that has absolutely no impact on us. He would in essence be leaving us alone to flourish. I don't know why I've got this cough today. I'm going to put this cough drop in my mouth. I'm not trying to be rude about it, but we'll just see how it goes. I may want to spitting it out.
This is how we're talking about David. And I have a question about David because he was a faithful son. They did the Davidic covenants and all. Why did God feel like he couldn't build his temple because he had been a man of war and left Saul?
Well, he said there was a lot of blood on David's hands from fighting all those wars to subdue their enemies. But there's something more about that too. Although that is an issue, David is the one that sets everything up. Why not just do it with David? Because there is an issue that is prevalent through everything, that it must be a father and a son. And that relationship that we have as sons also the relationship that the remnant is going to have as sons. Gosh, I almost just swallowed that. I guess I'll just cough. Okay. That father-son relationship is so imperative, it's in everything. So you have David writing to his son. Actually, he's writing a curriculum for sons, plural, but it doesn't just stop with the father. This is meant to be something that is carried on. It's in our... What do? We should be teaching these principles to a generation that follows us, who we expect to do what? Turn around and teach those to a generation following them. If we had known about this, many years ago, we could have been doing this all along. But that's an important principle, that it's not just the Father and He just does it. Because if that would be the case, that would be like God saying, look, you don't have any real part in this. But we do have a real part in this. Even in Israel's program, God undertook to do some things that Israel could not do for themselves. But does that mean they have no real part? They do have a real part, because once they become that great nation, they're the ones that are going to carry that message out there. God's not going to make any...
I can understand. What I don't understand is God said because he was a man of war, but David fought God's law. He was fighting for the side of righteousness.
He was.
And, I can understand if he would have said, made relations to father-son, and that's why we do this, and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But he didn't. He said man of war.
He did, but I just want you to know that principle is resident in that. Because as we study through, and I showed us a lot of things back in orientation about this, where it had to be, he keeps talking in terms of this is meant to go on. In other words, there's a father and a son, and a father and a son. And that principle is resident in there. As far as why being a man of war, if that was the only issue, that would have been enough. But why? I don't know the answer to that.
Well, it makes me wonder because
Huh?
It makes me wonder because I have been in a war.
Okay, but that...
And I'm wondering if there's something there that...
No, not for this. I am sure of that. I am sure of that. This is not anything here that would disqualify us the dispensation of grace. You have to understand that back here with Israel back here, even though David is writing much of the curriculum for a son, that won't take place with anyone in Israel's program until they get out here. Those people, they were still under the law. And what do you know about the law? It's a tutor and a governor. And if you're under tutors and governors, how's that sonship working? Not at all. Because that's made for an adult son who is making decisions in the best interest of his father. And he's not being told what to do. We talked about that earlier today. God's not telling a son what to do. He's educating a son so he makes those wise decisions out of what he knows. So David's writing it back here, but God didn't deal with Israel. I mean, he did talk about Israel, my son, and he used terminology like that. But in the issue of what we're talking about, of being adopted sons, no. They didn't have that. So there's a bit of a difference between, even though God's providing a curriculum back here, and why with David? Why do that here with David? Because he found in David what he was looking for in a son. A man after God's own heart. It's a heart issue. And when God finds that, remember he had all these brothers that were older. One of them, the oldest, he was big guy, looked like a king. Everybody thought that would be, Eliab would be the, and God says to Samuel, keep looking, that's not him.
Yeah, but David had more instruction from Jesse.
He did. He had the instruction from his father. There's that hand-me-down principle again. But he had a heart for God. God knew that. So he makes this covenant with David. there's some things that he's going to allow Solomon to do, and some promises we're about to read that he makes with Solomon, not because of Solomon, but because of David. But I don't fully know the answer to that other thing yet. I suspect that it's in there.
That just caught my attention.
Right. But I am sure that that has no bearing as far as our military people today or people who have been involved in that. This had to do with something very specific to building the temple. The Holy of Holies, and
You can see my point from if David was favored so much in God's eyes, and yet he wasn't qualified to build the temple, I'm sure I'm not as qualified in God's eyes.
Well, okay, but see, that's the same thing. Remember, I was telling you one time when I was looking at the law and trying to make an analogy to me. In the law, you know what? To be a priest, you had to be perfect and without blemish. And when I was born with this separation in my lip that got sewed up by a drunk doctor when I was a day old, and it made that permanent impression there, that would have disqualified me. And when I was a young preacher, I thought about that a lot, and I thought, maybe the reason I don't feel like God's calling me is because I have a blemish, and you know what? And God just wants perfection in that, like He did the priesthood, and that's what I thought. And then I learned about under grace. Those things don't matter to God. What really matters to Him, look, those things were that way in the priesthood because He was showing them a picture of something. They got caught up in the actual physical perfection of it. What He was looking for is a man whose heart was perfect toward God, and David fit that bill. So for you would be doing, if you thought that, you'd be doing the same thing I was doing back then. I was taking something in the law and trying to translate it in, for me. That doesn't work. Okay, but that's a good question. And that's something, I actually thought about at one point, so I can see why you got there. So my point now in setting all this up is to say, in spite of all this blessing and all the things that God is doing, it is Solomon that opens the door back up to Belial. And that's what we're about to read here. So now let's take this verse that I'd forgotten why it was up there because I was looking at notes I created before we actually did that last Sunday's lesson. But King Solomon loved many strange women together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, Ye shall not go in unto them, neither shall they come in unto you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave to these strange women in love. And then, continue to read, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods. And his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. Then did Solomon build a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. And likewise did he for all his strange wives, which burnt incense and sacrificed unto their gods. Before we keep reading, it's amazing. He's mentioned 4 gods here that he built high places or altars to, but it says right there at the end, and likewise did he for all his strange wives. He polluted the city. You know what he was doing? Excuse me. Solomon was inviting Belial right back into the nation in spite of all the things that God had done. And God told him, don't do this because they'll turn your heart away. What does he do? He turns right around and does it. And what God said was true. So now as we continue to read, and the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned from the Lord God of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he kept not that which the Lord commanded. And before we keep reading, I have to say, this really strikes me. The Lord himself appears to Solomon twice to say, don't go after other gods. Now look, it's one thing to hear a preacher say it. Can you imagine being Solomon and the Lord God appears to you 2 times and says, don't go after other gods? Wouldn't that make you think? You would think so, wouldn't you? But Satan is clever. He knows that if you don't have this discernment, he can pull the wool over your eyes. You don't even realize what's happening until it's too late. It's already happened. Now let's keep reading it. Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, for as much as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant, my statutes, which I have commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant. Notwithstanding, in thy days I will not do it for David thy father's sake. He says to Solomon, I'm going to take the kingdom away from you and give it to someone else. But because of David, because of some things I promised David, I'm not going to do it during your lifetime. Not in your days. But he says this, but I will rend it out of the hand of thy son. And that's when it's after Solomon dies and his son is going to take the throne. Remember the Rehoboam, Jeroboam thing we talked about some weeks back? The kingdom gets divided because look at verse 13. Howbeit, I will not rend away all the... By the way, David and Solomon are members of what tribe? Judah. So here's what God says. Remember when you have the nation, you have that southern kingdom. See the Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea kind of does like this. You have Jerusalem sitting right here. Essentially, the thing divides off this way. And here's what you have. You have Judah and you have Benjamin. And those get known as Benjamin, I don't remember. Anyway, that's Judah. Up here, you have the other 10 tribes, and that gets known as Israel. And so he says here, howbeit I will not rend away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to thy son David. Well, David is the tribe of Judah. He's going to give one tribe. That turns out to be Benjamin. And he said, give one tribe to thy son David, my servant, and for Jerusalem's sake, which I have chosen. And he tells them right up front exactly how this is going to happen. If you're in the nation of Israel and you're paying attention, when Solomon dies and all this stuff starts happening, you should have already seen the writing on the wall about what was coming. Not only did Leviticus talk about it, not only did Deuteronomy talk about it again, but now you've got this thing here. And so exactly what God said was going to be happening to them is what was happening. All right, now that's the end of that passage. So with Solomon, here's what happened. Things started spiraling downward, getting worse and worse. And because Solomon opened the door to kill Israel's distinctive, unique position in the world, but give them the gods that all these nations around them worship and make them like the other nations, because that was what was happening there, then you know what? They're setting themselves up. They go right back now under the second course of punishment, followed by the third, the fourth, and finally the fifth. They're cast out of the land. They become Satan's lawful captive. And now I'm going to read that verse that I didn't read to you back 2 Sundays ago. Isaiah 49:24. Shall the prey be taken from the mighty, or the lawful captive delivered? Now, if you've got that passage in front of you in your notes or with your Bible, let me encourage you to just put something out in the margin where it says, shall the prey be taken? The prey is the nation. The prey is Israel. Shall the prey be taken from the mighty? The mighty is is Satan, the adversary. He's the one, they're the prey, he's the predator. And then it says, or the lawful captive. Now we'll put this one down. Why is it the lawful captive? Because, look, well, I'll explain that in just a minute. Now you're right back, this is Israel again. So things are looking so bad that the prophet Isaiah is kind of asking a question rhetorically. Have you ever looked at someone that got it wrong, and you go, are you ever going to get it right? You're kind of asking the question. Well, this is what now Isaiah is looking at where Israel has come to, and he's saying, is the prey going to be taken away from the mighty? Or this lawful captive, is it going to get delivered? And the question is, how is Israel going to extricate herself from the adversary? So, and by the way, when they're in that condition, how much light are they shining to the world? None. They're exactly where Satan wants them to be. And they have cooperated with that process, by the way. Excuse me. So, what God meant for them to do is to labor with Him against the adversary. But no. Instead, they kind of cast God to the side, and their light was extinguished, and instead of qualifying themselves to labor with God, think about us and the armor of light. There's going to be something that is done to us to try to extinguish our light, while your Father is trying to train you to labor with Him in His operation against Satan. Satan is working to extinguish your light. Think about how you feel about the nation of Israel, who got themselves in a predicament where instead of being the light of the world, now they're part of the darkness. That's exactly what Satan... Now that's a parallel issue of what Satan wants to produce with us. And while they were supposed to have... you already know this, but Israel's primary sphere of influence was supposed to be on the world. Us, as the body of Christ, our primary influence is supposed to be the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. Now, I'm going to say it this way. These are the main focus of the impact. But it is also true that we not only can have an impact on the principalities and powers, we can have a secondary impact on men. And just as their primary impact was to be on the world, that nation was supposed to be the light of the world, there is also a secondary impact that they have on Satan and his realm. It's not their primary impact, but they do have an impact on Satan and his realm, if they're being the light of the world. So, you know what? If he can extinguish their light, they don't bother his area, and they don't shine to the world. The same is true for us. If our light goes out, we don't impact Satan's area one iota, and men aren't impacted either. Okay, now having said that, when we do shine as the light of the world, here's what we do. We qualify ourselves for that attack from the adversary. And that's the thing that I wanted us to get to. Now, I'm going to take us back to the book of Hebrews here for a moment. By the way, I need to see another page here because these are all jumbled up. I don't have that. I don't have that. There it is. I'm going to take us back over to the book of Hebrews because here's what I want you to understand. We have a sense and sequence to our education, right? We did a sonship orientation that told us about being sons. We did a sonship establishment, which kind of got us established in the fact of our sonship and kind of gave us a foretaste of what to look forward to. And then we got a sonship education started in Romans chapter 12. Now, I didn't break all this down. It's not important. You've had that before. But then we get a sonship education, and that education moves from milk to meat. We get that primary or initial instruction in wisdom, justice, judgment, which is what we're in the midst of now, and then following this will be equity. And that's the same format that Israel's education follows as they're going to do that. Now, we have books that take us through this. We know that ours runs from Romans to Philemon, because this was something that was written by our epistle. These are epistles written by our apostle. Man, you get STLE on it, and I just put any kind of front on it, don't I? These are epistles written by our apostle for a group of people that no one knew anything about. It was hidden from the foundation of the world. Okay, now I need a few extra minutes here in this first session. I know a little beeper went off. But we get Romans to Philemon. What is it that the believing remnant have? Well, guess what? Sitting back here with some things that David wrote, they have Psalms, Proverbs. As we mentioned last week, I said, there's another book, and you said the book of Job, and you were right. And then they not only have that, but they have some things that were written in the Old Testament prophets. And then they have some things that were written in the Gospels. And those things get written during the extension of mercy and the first part of the dispensation of grace. We'll talk about that in a second. And then they also have the Hebrew epistles, which is the book of Hebrews all the way through to the book of the Revelation. Now that means because this all is taking place in their program. So there it is. And just as there is a progression from milk to meat in ours, there's a progression of milk to meat in theirs as well. And what I'm about to show you is just a few of the details here about how their education lays out. Because remember when we did that stair-step thing at the first, and we talked about the levels of sonship and being a a simple son and a young man and a wise man and a man of understanding. They have progression in theirs as well. So when you get out here and you start talking about the believing remnant of Israel, they're supposed to be able to look back at the Psalms and the Proverbs. The Old Testament prophets say some things, and the Gospels even have references to those Old Testament. They pay special attention to that. And then in the book, and you know what these things are doing? These things, I'm just going to do it this way. This is a very broad way of doing it. But these things are supplying their sonship orientation and their sonship establishment. That's how they find out who they are in Christ, who they are as members of the believing remnant, the fact that they are sons. They find all of that out. And then when you get into Hebrews begins their education. And I'm going to tell you what they get in the book of Hebrews. They get wisdom and they get justice. And then when you get to the book of James, now this is their initial instruction, you understand. This is like simple son stuff. And when you get into the book of James, it's not till they get into the book of James that they start getting now into judgment. And the progression follows them just like it follows us. And what I want to show you is that you can see this progression. Now, this is going to take us to Hebrews chapter 5. And by the way, if Hebrews starts the education, if you're in Hebrews 5, you know they have already been taught some things in the education, right? They've already been given it. And he's going to talk about two things in the book of Hebrews: milk and strong meat. The strong meat is the advanced doctrine that they need of judgment. Remember when we got into judgment, I told you in Romans 13:11, you're about to enter a new level of your education. And we talked about that. This is true for them too. But here's the outstanding thing that's true. And I'm going to lay this out so when we come back after the break, we'll be able to do this. Here's what he's going to show them. That this is a different level of their education. This is where they're going to learn to think discerningly about things they see. That's not necessarily spelled out. In other words, there is no... Remember we talked about judgment is? It's not about deciding what's right and what's wrong. It's about deciding between things that are not so clearly spelled out. It may be 2 or 3 right things. How do you know what to do? It takes discernment to be able to do that. And not only that, this is the place where our light begins to shine. And if this is the place our light begins to shine, then that's also the place where we experience the opposition from the adversary. And so in order to do that, and here's what every writer in both programs know. Paul knows it in our program, and James knows it, and Peter knows it, and they write about it. That once you're going to get to this place in your education, if you're a member of the believing remnant of Israel, you're going to have to. I can't overemphasize this. I'm saying it to you, and I'm saying it plainly, but unless you really think about what I'm saying, you're going to miss this. It is, before they can get into judgment, it is absolutely imperative that the things they got in wisdom and justice are up and running in them. Those things can't be just something they got at one time. This has to be something that's alive in them, and it's working in them, and they're living out of it. Because here's why. This is like the foundation. And until you get a good foundation, you can't start putting up the superstructure of the walls and the roof. In the beginning part of our education, this is the walls. And equity is going to be the roof, so to speak. I don't mean to be exact when I say that. But look, that doesn't spring out of thin air. But what I'm trying to say is this. If we disregard what we learned in wisdom and justice and just kind of push it off to the side, we will not get this right. We can't, because this rests on this. Or to say it another way, in your notes, I wrote it this way. Think of judgment as being a plant, and wisdom and justice are the soil. The plant, if you just throw a plant down on the ground, it can't survive. You've got to plant it in soil that will nurture it and support it. And the life of the plant comes out of the soil. I'm serious. Judgment comes out of the soil of wisdom and justice. And if we just take judgment like it's a thing all on its own and throw it down here on the concrete, we'll come in next week and that thing will have withered and died. And that's what our judgment will do. And if that's where we are, what chance do we have against the adversary who's now been given the green light to extinguish our light? And I'm going to tell you the dangerous thing that comes with that. Because the attack against us is not just geared to extinguish our light. The attack against us is also geared to kill your desire to go on in your education. So that you don't want... And you know what? He's looking at this group and he's thinking, if I can get you guys to lose interest, if I can kill your desire to go on, I've got you. And you know what we'll be? We'll be like those people that don't ever really do anything. We just talk about. Remember when we did that illustration? What if firemen, if all they do is talk about the different kinds of fires, talk about the different kinds of ways that you fight a fire, but when the bell goes off, they never go put out a fire. Oh, but they become experts in all the talk, but they don't do? Well, Satan would be thrilled with that. In fact, you know what? He'd love for us to put on the big seminars about all the big talk, just so you don't do it. And that's what he's after. And so he wants to extinguish the light, there is no doubt, but at the same time he wants to kill your desire. And that's what the attack is geared to do. And if we don't have judgment really working in us, and I mean really working in us, that's what's going to happen. That is what, and you know what? And you're going to be going through a very specific and personal attack from his policy of evil. And even though you have been given everything you need to stand against it, you will not. And we can't afford to let that happen. This is how important it is. So here's what we're going to see when we come back, because I'm going to take you from Hebrews to James. Hebrews is going to make some statements and say, if you guys don't have this, you can't move on to this. You can't. And then James, is going to pick that up. And he's going to say, do you have anything missing here? And he's going to give them a checkpoint. And in fact, he's even going to come along and ask them specifically about this. Right at the first of his book, he'll say, do any of you lack wisdom? Now, in the old days, we looked at that verse very differently. I'm going to talk about how we looked at it. And I have a lot to say about that. But the truth is, this has to be up and running. And James knows it. Hebrews knows it. And they're counting on the fact that they've got, if you're missing anything here, you've got to go back and get it. Now, I'll end this session by saying this. Let's make a parallel issue. In our initial instruction in wisdom and justice, which runs from Romans 12:3 to Romans 13:11, if we're not living out of those things, here's what happens to us. We got to go back and get it. That's what last week was all about. Reminding us of the things that are sitting back there that we have to have alive in us, fresh in us, and that we're living out of. Because if we don't, we're in big trouble. Okay, so we'll stop here, we'll take a break, and then we'll come